The thick, humid air of the Vietnamese jungle was alive with sound, cicadas screaming, leaves rustling, and the faint metallic click of a soldier's rifle bolt. It was 1967. Deep in the highlands near Pleiku, and American soldiers were about to face an ambush that would haunt them for decades. They thought they were ready. They had the best training, the best gear, and a new rifle the Pentagon called revolutionary. The M16, sleek, lightweight, and deadly accurate, it was supposed to give American troops an edge against the guerrilla fighters of the Viet Cong. But what happened next shattered that illusion and the trust of every man who carried it. The first burst of enemy fire came from nowhere. A thunder of AK-47s splitting the air. Soldiers dove for cover, returning fire with their brand new M16s. But within seconds, something went horribly wrong. The rifles jammed. One after another, soldiers pulled their triggers only to hear the sickening click of a weapon that refused to shoot. In the chaos of that ambush, dozens of Americans were left helpless, desperately trying to clear their weapons as the enemy closed in. Some died with their rifles disassembled in their hands, their cleaning rods still jammed down the barrels. That horrifying scene wasn't an isolated incident. Across Vietnam, stories like it echoed through platoons and fire bases. The M16, once hailed as the rifle of the future, had become a symbol of betrayal. But how could a weapon designed by one of America's top engineers and approved by the Pentagon's finest minds fail so catastrophically in the field? To understand that, we have to rewind to the early 1960s, when the United States military was at a crossroads. The American arsenal was dominated by the M14, a powerful, wood-stocked rifle based on the legendary M1 Garand. It fired the heavy 7.62x 50 NATO round, packing enormous stopping power and range. But it was also heavy, with brutal recoil, and soldiers couldn't carry much ammo. In the new era of modern warfare, where speed, mobility, and automatic fire mattered more than long-range marksmanship, the M14 was quickly becoming outdated. The Pentagon wanted something new, lighter, faster, and more modern, something that could match or surpass the Soviet AK-47 that was arming communist forces around the globe. Enter Eugene Stoner, a brilliant firearms designer working for Armalite. Stoner created the AR-15, a radical new weapon that broke every rule of rifle design. It used lightweight materials like aluminum and fiberglass, fired a small caliber 5.56 mm round at incredible velocity, and could fire fully automatic with almost no recoil. On paper, it was a dream weapon. Soldiers could carry twice the ammo, fire faster, and still stay accurate. The rifle's sleek design and futuristic look made it feel like something straight out of science fiction. But dreams on paper rarely survive the politics of the Pentagon. When the Army tested Stoner AR-15, many traditionalists hated it. They called it toy gun, or pea shooter, and claimed the 5.56 Mullard bullet was too small to stop an enemy. The Army brass was deeply conservative, many of them veterans of World War II, and they trusted bigger bullets and wooden stocks, not lightweight plastic rifles. So instead of adopting the AR-15, the military doubled down on the M14. But that decision would prove disastrous once the U.S. became entangled in Vietnam. By the early 1960s, the M14's limitations were obvious. In Vietnam's dense jungles, its long barrel and heavy frame made it unwieldy. Troops complained they couldn't carry enough ammunition, and that the rifle kicked too hard for accurate automatic fire. Meanwhile, their enemies, North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas, were using the AK-47. Rugged, compact, and nearly indestructible, it was the perfect jungle weapon. It could be dropped in mud, soaked in rain, and still fire without fail. American troops saw it firsthand, and they started asking a dangerous question: why were their enemies better armed? The answer came from an unlikely source: Air Force General Curtis LeMay. He tested the AR-15 for his security forces and loved it. He pushed for its adoption across the U.S. military, arguing that its lightweight and accuracy would save lives. By 1964, under mounting pressure and amid growing chaos in Vietnam, the Pentagon finally decided to introduce the rifle, now renamed the M16. The M16's arrival was heralded as a revolution. The government boasted it was self-cleaning, more reliable, and the most advanced rifle ever made. Soldiers were told they didn't even need cleaning kits. The propaganda was powerful, but dangerously false. The Army rushed production, skipped critical field testing, and even changed the gunpowder formula in the ammunition without notifying the rifle's designer. That one decision would doom thousands of soldiers to face combat with weapons that would jam at the worst possible moment. The new ammunition used a different type of powder that created more residue inside the rifle's chamber. Combined with Vietnam's humid, muddy conditions, it turned the M16 into a ticking time bomb. Without proper cleaning, and without cleaning kits, rifles began to malfunction at terrifying rates. Soldiers found their guns jamming after just a few magazines. Extractor springs snap, chambers fouled, and sometimes a single speck of dirt could render the weapon useless. Reports flooded back from the field. Units wrote desperate letters to Congress and the Pentagon. One Marine commander reported that men are dying because their rifles fail them. Another letter described finding soldiers dead in combat, their rifles broken open beside them, cleaning rods still inside. These weren't isolated events. It was a full-blown crisis. The soldiers had been lied to. The rifle was not self-cleaning. It was not reliable. And worst of all, the people who had sold it to them, politicians, generals, and contractors, knew it. By 1966, the complaints had reached Washington. A congressional investigation revealed a shocking truth. The Army had ignored test results, skipped proper trials, and altered the rifle's design without authorization. The report was damning, but for the soldiers still in the jungle, it came too late. Trust was broken and the M16's reputation was in ruins. Yet, despite everything, the M16 would go on to evolve. It would be fixed, modified, and eventually become one of the longest-serving rifles in American history. But that transformation came only after a cost measured not in dollars, but in lives. Because for the men who carried the first M16s into the jungles of Vietnam, it wasn't just a weapon that failed them. It was a promise that their country would give them the best that had been broken. When word of the rifle's failures began circulating, it wasn't whispered anymore. It spread like wildfire through every firebase and jungle outpost in South Vietnam. The M16 had earned a new nickname among soldiers, the Mattel toy. Its black plastic furniture and light frame made it look like a child's plaything, and when it jammed in combat, that's exactly how it felt. Useless. Men cursed it, kicked it, and swore they'd rather carry the enemy's AK-47 than their own issued weapon. There was a bitter irony in that sentiment. The AK-47, the rifle of America's enemies, had become the one they respected most. It fired every time. It could be dropped in mud covered in grime and still function. Meanwhile, the M16, America's supposed symbol of technological superiority, failed under the slightest strain. It was as if the jungle itself had turned against the weapon. Humidity, dirt, and rain, all natural elements of Vietnam, exposed its fragility. Letters home from soldiers painted a grim picture. One Marine wrote to his family, "We have to clean our rifles every hour or they'll jam when we need them most." Some of the guys have started picking up AKs from the enemy. Another said bluntly, "They gave us rifles that kill us instead of the Viet Cong." In Washington, the Pentagon tried to contain the fallout. Officials insisted the problems were exaggerated, blaming soldiers for poor maintenance or improper cleaning habits. But the truth couldn't be buried. Battlefield reports, casualty numbers, and first-hand testimony told a different story. The M16 wasn't failing because of the men. It was failing the men. The Army's Ordnance Department came under fire. Critics accused it of arrogance and denial, clinging to outdated processes and ignoring field realities. The problem at its core was bureaucratic pride. The Ordnance Corps had resisted the AR-15 from the start. They hadn't designed it. They hadn't controlled it. And when the Pentagon forced its adoption, they made quiet but crucial changes that undermined the weapon's reliability. The switch in gunpowder was the most devastating. Eugene Stoner's original rifle had been designed around a specific, clean-burning powder called IMR. But Army supply chains favored a cheaper, dirtier alternative known as ball powder. This produced higher pressure and more fouling, causing carbon buildup that jammed the chamber. The result? Rifles that failed catastrophically in the middle of firefights. It wasn't just the ammunition. The early M16s lacked chrome-lined barrels and chambers, a standard feature in most military rifles at the time. Chrome lining prevents corrosion and makes cleaning easier, especially in humid environments like Vietnam. The AK-47 had it, the M16 did not. That oversight alone doomed countless rifles to rust and failure. By 1967, the crisis had reached a boiling point. Troops demanded answers. Media outlets began reporting on the scandal, and families of fallen soldiers demanded accountability. That year, a House Armed Services Subcommittee led by Congressman Richard Eckord launched an official investigation into the M16 program. What they uncovered was a web of neglect, misinformation, and outright deception. The hearings were explosive. Testimonies from soldiers described guns jamming during combat, sometimes after just a few rounds. Photographs of dead Marines found with cleaning rods jammed into their rifles were entered into evidence. It was impossible to deny anymore. The M16 had failed in the most unforgivable way. It had failed when men's lives depended on it. The investigation revealed that the rifle had been rushed into service without proper field testing. Some officers had even protested its deployment, warning that it wasn't ready for jungle warfare. Their concerns were ignored. The Pentagon was more interested in meeting political deadlines and maintaining the illusion of technological superiority than ensuring reliability in the field. When the truth finally came out, the outrage was immense. Congress demanded changes. The Army scrambled to fix the rifle's design and restore trust among the troops. Chrome-lined chambers were added. Cleaning kits were finally issued, something that should have been done from day one. New training manuals emphasized maintenance, and soldiers were taught how to properly care for the weapon in tropical conditions. But the damage to morale had already been done. To the men in the field, the M16 wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a symbol of betrayal. They joked bitterly that the enemy has the best rifle. The sight of an AK-47 slung over a comrade's shoulder wasn't unusual. Some soldiers carried them out of necessity, others out of defiance. It was a quiet rebellion against a system that had let them down. In that environment, survival instincts overrode regulations. Men who once trusted the American military machine learned a hard truth: politics and profit could be just as deadly as enemy fire. The M16 scandal became more than a story about a gun. It became a story about how bureaucracy, pride, and indifference could cost lives. Eugene Stoner, the rifle's designer, was furious. He had warned against changing the ammunition and skipping tests, but his voice was drowned out by higher-ups chasing deadlines and contracts. "They broke my rifle," he later said. It wasn't the weapon that failed, it was the system. Over time, fixes did arrive. The improved M16A1 incorporated chrome-lined parts, better ammunition, and more reliable components. When maintained correctly, it could perform well, even rival the AK-47 in accuracy and range. But convincing soldiers to trust it again was another matter. Trust, once broken, doesn't return easily. By 1968, after years of loss and controversy, the rifle finally began to earn redemption. Troops trained with the upgraded models reported fewer jams and greater reliability. Yet, for many veterans, the scars of those early failures never faded. They remembered the men who had died holding jammed rifles, and they never forgave the people responsible for putting those rifles in their hands. The M16's story during Vietnam wasn't just a technological failure, it was a moral one. It revealed how disconnected decision-makers in Washington had become from the realities of combat. For every general who praised the rifle in a press release, there was a young soldier in the jungle praying it wouldn't jam when he needed it most. And that contrast between the image of American innovation and the reality of soldiers abandoned by their own equipment would define the rifle's legacy for decades to come. As the war dragged on and the body count climbed, so too did the myth of the perfect weapon. The Pentagon wanted victory through technology, but Vietnam proved that no amount of engineering could replace understanding, and no machine could save a soldier when human judgment failed. The M16 would eventually become a mainstay of the U.S. arsenal, but in Vietnam it had earned a darker reputation, one written not in manuals or reports, but in the memories of those who fought and bled beside it. By the early 1970s, the M16 had transformed. The improved M16A1 was a far cry from the weapon that had failed so many in the mid-60s. Chrome plating, proper cleaning gear, and improved ammunition solved most of the mechanical issues that once plagued it. On paper, it had become the rifle it was always meant to be: reliable, accurate, and effective. But for those who had fought through the worst years of Vietnam, the ghosts of the original M16 still lingered. Ask any veteran who carried the early model, and their memories were rarely kind. They remembered the weight of fear, not from the enemy, but from wondering whether their rifle would work when they needed it most. They remembered watching friends die trying to fix a jammed bolt, and the cold anger that followed when Washington blamed poor maintenance instead of poor decisions. It wasn't just a weapon that failed, it was a betrayal of trust. The M16 story became a mirror reflecting a deeper truth about the Vietnam War itself, a war built on half-truths, overconfidence, and a belief that technology could compensate for human failure. Just as political leaders underestimated the will of the Vietnamese people, military leaders overestimated the power of their machines. The M16 became the perfect symbol of that arrogance, a weapon designed to win on paper, not in the mud and rain of real combat. Yet, over time, something unexpected happened. Despite its bloody introduction, the M16 didn't fade away, it evolved, just like the soldiers who carried it. From the M16A1 came the A2, A3, and A4. Then, shorter carbines like the M4. Each generation refined the rifle, making it more accurate, more reliable, and more versatile. The same basic design that had once betrayed American troops in Vietnam would eventually become one of the most successful and longest-serving rifles in military history. There's irony in that. The weapon that started as a disaster would go on to define American military firepower for decades. But the lessons learned from its early failures would shape every firearm development that followed. Reliability became sacred. Field testing became mandatory. Never again would the U.S. military introduce a weapon without understanding how it performed in real-world combat. The M16's failure forced the Pentagon to listen, finally, to the soldiers on the ground. It forced accountability. It forced humility. And while the price of those lessons was unbearably high, they ensured that future generations would never face the same betrayal. Still, for those who fought in the jungles of Vietnam, the rifle's redemption couldn't erase the pain. Many veterans refused to touch an M16 after the war. Some who joined law enforcement or continued their military careers requested different weapons entirely. The rifle had become a scar, a reminder of a system that had treated soldiers as expendable test subjects for unproven technology. But for younger soldiers who entered service after the fixes, the M16 was something else entirely. It was light, accurate, and lethal. They learned to clean it properly, maintain it meticulously, and trust it. A trust that earlier generations had been denied. They used it in Panama, Grenada, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Decades later, it became clear the M16 story wasn't one of permanent failure, but of painful evolution. The Vietnam-era M16 failure wasn't caused by bad design. It was caused by arrogance, bureaucracy, and a lack of empathy for the men who would actually pull the trigger. The technology was brilliant, but leadership failed, and that's what history remembers most. When you strip away the politics, the science, and the statistics, the story of the M16 in Vietnam is, at its heart, a human story. Young men, some barely out of high school, trusted their country to arm them with the best. Instead, they were handed rifles that jammed, ammunition that corroded, and promises that collapsed under fire. Their courage was real. Their sacrifices were real. But their tools betrayed them, and that betrayal echoed far beyond the battlefield. It shattered the myth of American infallibility, the idea that technology alone could win wars. Vietnam taught a brutal lesson: wars aren't won by machines, they're won by people. And when you fail the people, you lose everything. In later years, military historians would dissect every aspect of the M16's debut. They'd analyze chamber pressures, powder residues, and firing cycles. They'd map out production changes and logistical oversights. But none of those charts or diagrams could capture what it felt like to be there. To hear the click of a jammed bolt when your life depended on a single shot. That's the part history books often forget: the sound of fear in the jungle, the silence after the click. The Vietnam War was full of such silences. Moments where soldiers were left alone, stranded between flawed policies and failed promises. The M16 became one of those moments, frozen in time. Yet, even within failure, there's something hauntingly human. It's the drive to fix what's broken, to learn to adapt. That same spirit that carried soldiers through the mud and misery of Vietnam carried the M16 through its own redemption arc. By the time America left Vietnam in 1975, the M16 had finally become the weapon it was meant to be. But its redemption was too late for the thousands who had carried it in its worst form. For them, the war had already written its verdict, and no later success could rewrite those early chapters. Still, in a way, their suffering gave future soldiers a better chance. Every jammed rifle, every letter home, every congressional testimony forced a reckoning. The U.S. military learned that innovation without testing, and confidence without humility, lead to tragedy. The M16 story became a case study taught in military academies, not as a celebration of engineering, but as a warning about the cost of neglecting the human element in war. The rifle that once failed would go on to be trusted by millions. But the question lingers: what if it had worked from the start? How many lives might have been saved? How many letters home would never have been written? We'll never know. But every time a modern soldier shoulders an M4, the M16's descendant, they carry not just a weapon, but a legacy forged in blood and lessons learned the hard way. The M16's failure wasn't the end of its story. It was the beginning of a transformation that mirrored the military itself. From arrogance to awareness, from assumption to adaptation, the rifle became a teacher, one that demanded humility from those who once thought they could engineer their way out of any war. And maybe that's the real legacy of the M16 in Vietnam, not the failure itself, but what it forced America to see: that the true strength of any army isn't found in its weapons, but in the hands, hearts, and minds of the men who carry them. Because when the rifles jammed and the smoke cleared, the lesson that remained was simple: technology can change, wars can evolve, but trust, once broken, must be earned again. One bullet, one battle, one soldier.